Here it is, my response to Hermosillo and Wood's interview with Nate Eaton of East Idaho News. I have so much respect for these two men, even more than I did before, which is saying a lot. Welcome to True Crime, Faith, and Chocolate. I'm your host, Annette Lyon, USA Today bestselling author of the suspense novel Just One More. I'm also a woman of faith, member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is the faith that Chad and Lori Daybell purport to believe in, but yeah, right. And I'm also a true crime junkie, which is why we are here. We got Lieutenant Hermosillo, who was one of the first detectives on the case when it came to Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow and the children and Tammy's death. And then Prosecutor Rob Wood, who was part of the team that prosecuted both Lori and Chad. They sat down with Nate and they had a really nice long interview, and so here are my highlights. The first word they get of anything to do with this case is November 1st of 2019. At this point in the whole timeline, Chad and Lori have been having an affair for about a year, and Charles died the previous July. Tylee then was murdered early September. JJ a few weeks after that. Tammy a few weeks after that. Brandon Boudreaux was attempted to be killed in there, somewhere in there as well. Forgetting actually if it was, I think it was before Tammy's death, I believe, but I have to double check the dates on that. The first they heard was after the attempted murder of Brandon Boudreaux. Of course, this is at the time the almost ex-husband of Melanie Boudreaux, now Melanie Pulowski, also known as Melanice. Lori's niece. So there's two Melanies in the story. This is her niece, who is a daughter figure, the daughter of Lori's sister Stacy, who died relatively young when Melanie was just a toddler or preschool age. Gilbert Police Department from Arizona calls them and says, hey, we are trying to find this Jeep that was involved in an attempted murder. Would you please see if you can find it up there? That was when Hermosillo first heard about anything to do with this case. Then a few days later, on November 4th, Hermosillo comes to him and says we need to get a warrant to look for this Jeep. Rob Wood said he recalls seeing pictures that Gilbert police had sent up. He said that there was a picture of Tylee, he remembered specifically. He didn't remember seeing one of JJ, and I'm wondering if it was just because it was the Jeep at that point. The case, that was all the case was looking for the Jeep. He said that there was a picture of Charles because that was relevant at that point. And of course, Brandon because he was the attempted victim, but not the Daybells, not Chad or Tammy or anything like that, because they weren't part of the case that they knew of yet. So that was November 1st and November 4th when Hermosillo first heard from the Gilbert police, and then on the 4th when Rob Wood did, the prosecutor. So then you go to like 3 weeks later, November 25th. I believe this is the weekend of Thanksgiving. They get another call from Arizona law enforcement. And this is when we finally get the welfare check. When we hear, this is when Kay called and said, I can't find or hear from my grandson, JJ. We're looking for him. And would you please check on him? And she had found the address in Rexburg where Lori had likely moved, and she passed that along. And so Gilbert police in Arizona, they're putting together the pieces, realizing that this Jeep that was connected to this attempted murder of Brandon, it's connected to Charles's murder, it's connected to Lori, who has now moved to Rexburg, and they're starting to put these pieces together, and they don't know where JJ is. The police did the welfare check. They had already been doing surveillance because of the Jeep situation. So they knew that Chad and Lori were married, as we've talked about on previous videos. They knew that they were already married. When they first approached the apartment complex, they met Alex and Chad, who pretended to be just friends, not brothers-in-law, and Chad pretended to not know who Lori was and pretended not to have her phone number and all that fun stuff. Hermosillo, it was fascinating hearing his experience about talking to Alex in this particular situation. He described it as weird. And coming from a law enforcement individual who has had experience across the board, when he says weird, I believe it when he says it's weird. It's weird. He said the whole thing, the vibe was just bizarre. Alex had this 1,000-yard stare, and he kept moving forward, like a few inches at a time. He would step closer to Hermosillo, and then Hermosillo would take a few steps back, and then Alex would keep stepping forward. And it was this whole weird, creepy vibe. At this point, keep in mind, Hermosillo knows that this man in front of him shot and killed Charles and attempted to kill Brandon. Is suspected of that one, at least, but we know he shot Charles. And so when he's stepping toward this detective, let's not do that. When he left, he actually called Ron Ball, which is one of the other detectives, and he says, something's going on. Talk about understatement of the year. He didn't know what was going on because there's something going on here. You know, spidey senses going off. And so he says, I need you to go check that apartment with your body cam. And he went out, so Ron Ball did, had a conversation with Lori. We've heard that audio, and then now in Chad's trial, we saw the video as well. Early first thing in the morning on November 26th, the very next day, they go to Rob Wood's office and ask for warrants to go search the apartments, because they're searching for the kids. They're starting to, I think at this point they started to realize that Tylee is missing now too. So now we have 2 missing children. At this point, they think the children are still alive. Something's creepy, that's going on. We don't know what, but at this point, let's just find the kids. Are they in a bunker? Are they with some neighbors somewhere? They don't know, but let's find the kids. That's the focus. Let's just do that. A few weeks go by of trying to find the kids, trying to follow leads, and of course nothing's panning out yet. Chad and Lori have left. They've fled. December 19th, then that's when law enforcement goes public and asks the public for help finding the children. The FBI has been involved at this point and helped them draft a press release for this press conference. And Nate Eaton specifically says this was a pretty big press release. It was longer than most. It was better written, didn't have typos. It had photographs of the children. It specifically said things like the kids are in danger. And Rob Wood said that's a very unusual thing to see in a press release. You don't just drop something like that into a press release. But they were really trying to figure out what's going on and get the public's help. And that included trying to get videos and photographs from anyone who had been at Yellowstone during the last time they knew that Tylee had been seen there. He also interviewed Doug Hart from the FBI and about some of the digital research and the plans to search Yellowstone that didn't end up needing to happen. If you're interested, let me know. Drop a note in the comments. Nate, but the huge effort there. So let me know if you're interested in some of that. Let's talk about the creepy factor, especially when it came to listening to things like that. The recordings that Ian Pulowski did when he was wearing a wire for the FBI, right after he married Melanie and started realizing, oh, I married into a culty family. He's like, yeah, it was kind of creepy listening to them talk about me and how, because they said, oh yeah, Hermosillo's not going to stop. And he's dark, therefore a zombie, a dark translated being, a servant of Satan. He said that, when you're working as a police officer, you know that your life is always on the line. You understand that it's a sacrifice that you're aware of that could happen at any time you're in danger. But this put it on a whole new level because, number one, this group of people, they're taking out anyone who is dark. And I've been deemed dark, he said, essentially. So they might try to take me out. And then, worst of all, his family. Are they in their crosshairs too? We don't know, and that's terrifying. He would actually tell his family to drive home different ways, circle the block, make sure you're not being followed. What a weight that must have been. I can't even imagine. I have a loved one who was retired police, and I worried about him all the time. I actually have mentioned this to family that Hermosillo reminds me of him. The way he approaches things, that he looks so tough, but he has a soft heart. Yeah. Those who know my family know that's Hermosillo. That's him. Very similar. Right before they started asking for the public's help, about a week before, they had exhumed Tammy's body. And of course, the very next day, Alex dropped dead. Things got weird fast. Nate asked, well, what do you think of Alex's death? This was actually a surprise to me. Like so many of us think that Alex's death is still so suspicious and so bizarre. We do know that there were blood clots in his lungs. that was real. Hermosillo said that he is still trying to wrap his brain around it, but he thinks it was probably natural causes because he trusts the Arizona Medical Examiner's Office and the autopsy, specifically because they knew about the case already. They went into the autopsy thinking it was suspicious and looking for something suspicious, and they didn't find anything besides the blood clots. I've heard that maybe there was some toxicology that might have been not something they would have normally looked at, potentially the malachite rings and all that kind of, what if he was exposed to malachite? I've tried to do some research on that and haven't found anything. It sounds like malachite, it would have shown up as copper poisoning, and that doesn't show up as embolisms. More of like liver issues, not lungs. So I don't know. But he said, maybe it was divine intervention. But when he first heard about Alex's death, he said his first thought was just relief because the hitman can't hurt anyone else. Not just him, but anyone else that these crazy people were deeming dark, the hitman can't hurt them. And he said, maybe it was divine intervention. I don't know. But thank heavens that Alex was gone because he can't hurt anyone else. The way he heard about Alex's death is that Detective Pillar called him from the hospital and said, "You won't believe what I'm going to tell you." I hadn't even thought about like the relief that the hitman's gone. Rob Wood said that he learned about it because I remember exactly where I was standing, but I don't remember who told me. But when asked, what do you think, was it natural causes? It seems so coincidental. And he says, stranger things have happened. This whole case was bizarre. This whole case was just so weird. And then we moved to Hawaii to try to get Chad and Tammy back. Apparently, Rob Wood had just recently been appointed prosecutor. He had been deputy prosecutor before that, but his predecessor had just retired. So then he was then moved up deputy county attorney to being county attorney. When they were heading to Hawaii, it was a quick decision, it sounds like, to go. Once they made that decision, they left pretty quickly. The Hawaii prosecutor actually asked for Rob Wood to come. He went, and at that point, Hermosillo said he still thought the kids were alive. Rob Wood said at that point he hoped the kids were alive. And he said that you have to kind of move forward with the hope and the belief that they are, because you have to do your job and do everything you can to bring people home. Now, when it came to extraditing Lori and back to Idaho and even trying to find any kind of charges, this was fascinating to me because it seemed very natural that, she would be charged and then brought back to Idaho and carry on. But it wasn't quite that simple. For one thing, they had to find something that was a felony to charge her on, because you can't generally get an extradition from one state to another on a misdemeanor. It has to be something much more serious. It needs to be a felony. So, what if at this point they didn't have much evidence of anything really that they could point to. What would be a felony that we can charge her with to get her back? And Rob Wood said he was at a training and he wasn't paying very close attention, and I'm not sure, wasn't clear if it was something someone said at the training that piqued his interest, or if he was just researching things and came across it as he's ignoring the training. But he said he came across a statute, the Child Protection Action. They call it like the deadbeat dad law or something like that. It aimed at deadbeat parents who abandon their kids and who are supposed to be taking care of them. He wrote through the entire statute and he goes, this can apply. I don't know that it's ever been applied this way, but Lori's done all of these things, and that's a felony. So that's how they were able to then have that charge when they didn't know anything else about where the kids were or anything else. So they worked tirelessly. Their whole team was working to make sure that this warrant to get her, the charges that were going to be laid out, the warrants to search everything in Hawaii, everything would be airtight. They wanted to make sure it was done by the book, and that's something they repeated, and just like the jurors did. In my juror react video, I was so impressed because they wanted to make sure everything was completely accurate and precise of the way it needed to be done by the book, so that nothing would be overturned on technicality. Everything needed to be done accurately and by the law, which I really appreciated. And they said that with so many people involved working the case, it would have been very easy to have media leaks that could have hurt the investigation, but they didn't. And they talked about the challenge that there is with giving the media information, and the media, of course, is hungry and they want to know, and also not giving them too much that could hurt the investigation in the long run. Trying to get the public's help as well. So how much do you tell, how much do you don't? And so everyone just work their tails off. And would say that the original plan was to serve Chad and Lori, or I guess Lori, the papers at the condo, the search warrant. Because she was served papers about the child abandonment charges at the pool. But when they were going to be served the warrants for searching their vehicle and their condo, the plan was just to do it at the condo, but they started to leave and they didn't know if they were fleeing, where they were going, if they'd been tipped off. So they used a traffic stop instead. They get Lori arrested. They extradite her to Idaho. And again, the media is going crazy at this point, but they're keeping a pretty tight lid on like when Lori's arriving at the airport in Idaho and all that kind of stuff. Lori's in jail. And now they start to surveil Chad. They can't arrest him, even on these child abandonment charges, because he had no responsibility toward them. Technically, legally, he's their stepfather, but he has no other connection to these children. So they just have to surveil him and hope they find something. One thing that they ended up doing a lot of, and I pity the poor people who were in charge, and it was several individuals, it sounds like, because it was a team effort, was monitoring the many jail phone calls between March of 2020 and then June 9th of 2020, when Chad was arrested. There were a lot of calls. They said hours at a time per call and multiple calls per day. And you had to listen to it all because you never knew when a little nugget would drop. But he said it was like junior high kids talking, "Oh, I love you so much." And then it was often in coded language. We heard one of the calls. I maybe we'll react to that at some point. It's like gagging and also alarming. And something that also cracked me up, and they didn't play any of this in trial. They wouldn't need to convict, but it would have been hilarious to hear. Apparently they sang to each other. I can't imagine that Chad had a good singing voice. Just a guess. And although I think if I were to hear what they sang, I would suspect it's probably like hymns or something, and then it would be sacrilegious and piss me off even more. So maybe it's good that I haven't heard it. The investigation was so tricky because this case had so many parts. It was just the sprawling thing with so many pieces, and you'd have warrants out for Google and warrants out for this or that. Yeah, so many different things, and they would come in it back at different times, and so they had like spreadsheets, and I don't know if it was bulletin boards or whiteboards or what, but they had to keep so many things straight just to keep track of all the information as it came in, whether it was iCloud stuff or it's geolocating and so many different things. They didn't get the first iCloud dump until June 8th of 2020, which was the day before they found the children's bodies. They did have some of the geolocating stuff already though, that's how they found the kids. So here were some of the process of the steps. And so many people were involved. It was amazing. They said that the first break in finding the kids was the infamous raccoon text. And Hermosillo specifically said Ben Dean, and I don't know his position, but he said Ben Dean is the one who found that text and recognized that it was important. And I believe he said that even that was the only text from that particular phone that they ended up using moving forward. This poor guy had to go through just a crap ton, like thousands and thousands of texts. Then you get that with Ricky Wright from the FBI, some of his geolocating work, putting Alex in two very specific spots on Chad's property the day after the raccoon text. And of course, we know Tylee was killed first and then JJ later. So that all of these things are lining up. If the kids were on the property, they had a pretty good idea of roughly where, because of where Alex had spent some time. Hermosillo said that they also were looking at other places that Alex's phone had been, including out in desert areas, which, you know, you'd think that is very likely where they could dump a body. Walking around, didn't find anything. And so when they got a warrant eventually to search the property, he was like, I hope this is not another dead end. I hope this doesn't just dry up like everything else we've tried. But Wood thought, no, I think we've got something here. So we had the raccoon text, we had geolocating that put Alex on the property. Melanie Gibb and David Warwick, in an interview, had told them that, and this didn't come out in trial specifically because it would have been hearsay, but it helped them put the pieces together and find the children. It was enough to get a warrant. Lori told her that Alex took JJ with him. And the police were like, I think we know what that means. Melanie Gibbs' statement on that, the raccoon text, the geolocating of Alex's phone on the property, and then talking to Samantha Gulliam, Tammy's sister. We heard that there's a pet cemetery. Do you know anything about that? And she says, yes, right here. And it's one of the spots Alex's phone had been at. And that all of those things put together was enough to get a warrant for the property. The warrant itself was served on June 9th of 2020. They took a long time to write it correctly, to plan it. They had the evidence response team for the FBI helping with that. The whole thing was strategized. You can go look at my timeline video for some of that. They wanted to make sure that the warrant was airtight. Everything was exactly as it needed to be. They were still worried it wouldn't pan out. Wood thought, if the kids had been buried on the property, surely they've been moved by now. If they had been buried back in September, remember this is now June, for the following year, surely they've been moved. There's no way that they would still be there, right? One would think. And they thought, well, if they're not on the property, then we'll go to do our big massive Yellowstone search next. Fortunately, that didn't have to happen. Serving the warrant, Hermosillo and Wood were both there. Chad read the papers. He's sitting in a recliner, and his kids are on the couch. He didn't say which of the kids. I'm assuming Garth and Mark and Emma, most likely. Maybe Joe, his son-in-law. Hermosillo said he's watching for Chad's reaction because he thought, okay, his reaction will tell us if we're all on the right track. But Chad had no reaction. There was no change in his expression. And Hermosillo was like, crap, is this not what we thought it was? But no, Chad just doesn't respond to anything, right? We know this. But then he said Chad went outside, he asked if he could call someone. Called Lori from his car and was looking over his shoulder at the pond area, where that's where JJ was found. And that's when Hermosillo goes, okay, I think maybe we do have something. Yeah, it got emotional. So I'm gonna play a little bit.
When the first sign of JJ was found, what did word just spread among all the investigators there?
Yeah, everybody in the backyard was kind of doing their own thing that they were tasked to do, and a bunch of us were over under the tree where JJ was found. And once JJ was found, I think everybody kind of stopped working on everything else and came over. And that was when it kind of hit, yeah, that we had finally found him.
And what about when Tylee was found?
We knew if JJ was there, Tylee was there somewhere. And so, you know, the ERT team did a great job with kind of mapping everything out and sectioning things off. And then when Tylee was finally found, it was, you know, a sense of relief, but a lot of emotion that morning. Yeah.
And meanwhile, you're hearing this. You're hearing that.
So yeah, when the warrant was initially served, I had gone out with everybody first thing in the morning. I just kind of was sitting in my car, and then I started getting phone calls from attorneys. Went back into Rexburg. I had some things I had to do for some other cases that morning. And I was driving back out, and I kind of remember just had this feeling like, they're gonna find something. And Ron Ball called. He said, I think we found JJ. At that point, they had just barely uncovered the plastic. And so I went out and watched as they uncovered JJ. I mean, that was a really heavy moment. Relieved to know where he is, but
You felt a lot of different emotions.
Yeah.
You felt anger.
Yeah.
You felt relief, confusion. Why would they do this to this little boy?
Yeah.
Just so much. But then Nate, you have to bury that and still work and still get him out of the ground and still continue throughout the day. And I think that was the hardest for everybody was still trying to do that because we all have kids. And when you're faced with that, it's just kind of nobody's ever, we're trained as police officers, prosecutors, you're going to see that kind of stuff. But when you first see it like that, it kind of hits you. It was such a blur. I can't even tell you if that phrase really resonated in my head at that time because of everything we were dealing with in that backyard.
Yeah, it's not like you run back to the police station or the office and watch the video.
Right.
You've just found 2 kids, and not only is one, horribly bound and wrapped in plastic, the other, there's not much left. So, what was that process like in the dirt on a warm summer day, trying to find whatever you can, knowing that this is probably Tylee?
Like I said, you kind of put that in the back of your mind, and it's hard, and a lot of people kind of broke down. For a split second, and then it was back to digging. So that was a hard day.
So yeah, I highly recommend watching the whole interview. It's over an hour long, but it's powerful stuff. You see these men who have deep, deep hearts. It was interesting that also the initial charges on Chad were not for murder. They didn't have evidence to charge him on that yet. Remember, the iCloud dump just came the day before. They still hadn't gone through any of that. There was so much to still go through. So they had to get him on something else. Initially, it was a conspiracy to hide evidence. So they had 24 hours to officially file those charges. And Rob Wood said, I was going to make sure that those charges were written up precisely, exactly as they needed to be done. And so he took his time on that. The next day, the court calls him and says, "Okay, where are the charges? We're coming on 24 hours soon." He goes, "I still have 2 hours. I just have 2 more hours. I want to be sure I get it right." So yeah, he made sure to do that. He got it in within the 24 hours and he got them written correctly. Initially, he had those charges sealed because the details were very sensitive. Of course, now they're very much public. The next little part was confusing. If anybody knows what happened, I would love to hear, because I've seen 2 conflicting things. It seemed to sound like the Wood wanted a grand jury, but couldn't due to COVID restrictions. They had to then just have a preliminary hearing or something like that. But Doug Hart, in his interview with Nate, talked about a grand jury. So I'm not entirely sure what happened there. Who's remembering things incorrectly, or if there was some weird other kind of hearing because of the pandemic, or I don't know. They did say, though, that the pandemic made everything harder, that they were rotating in and out of the office, trying to keep the lockdown rules, but the office felt like a ghost town, and there were so many extra pressures that made the whole process of investigation more difficult. Nate asked what they felt when the cases were severed. So, because Chad and Lori were going to be tried together as co-conspirators, but then Judge Boy severed the case. There's a couple of reasons for that, but neither one of them wanted to comment on whether they thought it was the right decision, but they both said that they were disappointed. And Doug Hart said the same thing in his interview. They were disappointed, but whether they agreed or understood why Boyce severed them is irrelevant. They said It would have been nice just to try the case once, but Hermosillo specifically said would have done it 9 times if that's what it took to get justice for Tylee, JJ, and Tammy. It would have been nice to just do it once. They had to do it twice. We would have kept doing it if that's what it took. And it's like, dang, you guys are awesome. Awesome human beings. And then toward the end of the interview, Nate said, describe the case. How would you just describe it? Like, and they both were like, how do you even put this into a nutshell? How do you describe this? The way Wood described it, he goes, it's just a whole other level of out there. Like, it was like nothing he'd seen before. Hermosillo described it as, he goes, it was like playing Dungeons and Dragons, because on the one hand, because you had like spiritual swords in people's heads and weird things like that. But then he said, it was a case of constant surprises. Just when you think you can't be surprised anymore, something else weird would come up. This is the height of bizarre, and then something else happens. Wood talked about how there were times in Chad's trial or even preparation for it, where you would see evidence that you'd seen 100 times before, but suddenly you saw it in a slightly different way, and you're like, oh, that means something different now that I'm looking at it with these eyes. I wish he would have been more specific. I would have loved to hear examples. Nate asked, oh, how did you get through it? It had to take a toll. And they said, well, yeah, it does take a toll and on our poor families too. How do you do it? Wood said he compared it to being deployed, because he has been deployed. It sounds like a couple of times at least. Not sure on numbers, but he has experience with deployment. And he said, when you have a mission, you just do it. You just keep pushing. You just do it. Wood was asked, when did you start thinking about your closing arguments? Because he gave, if you recall, he gave a closing argument in Lori's case, and he gave the opening argument in Chad's. So he asked, so when did you start thinking of what should be in a closing argument? He said June 9th, the day of the warrant, when they found the children. He started thinking about how you would summarize this case then. And of course, this is a way before he had a lot of the details that would end up in those closing arguments. When asked about, were you concerned about the results of the trial, they said that, you know, they both seemed to agree, especially Wood. He said, I was never worried in either case that they would have an acquittal. There was too much evidence. But he was worried that maybe they would have one juror and that would lead to a hung jury, and so they'd have to do a retrial. And that was, you know, so let's just get this done and get the conviction. He didn't want to have to deal with a hung jury, which I thought was interesting. And that also goes to show just how strong the case was, because usually, even with a strong case, you'll have prosecutors say, you know, you never know what a jury's going to do. But that's pretty powerful stuff. So there's been some bitter, and you know what? Now that we've had Chad and Lori, they're both convicted. We both have strong sentences. It's not over yet. We've got appeals coming. We've got the Lori's trial coming up about Charles and Brandon in Arizona. But you know what? It's time to celebrate. I think I'll go grab myself a Kit Kat. Or some C's. Or some Rocky Road. I don't know. What are you going to go grab? Let me know in the comments. And while you're still here, click like on this video, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single thing. Make sure you click the notification button, and we'll see you next time.